In the next two videos, we'll be discussing SARS-CoV-2 vaccination. In the first video, we will examine the concept of herd immunity, followed by the basics of vaccine design. We will also discuss both the advantages and potential challenges of vaccinations against SARS-CoV-2. In the second video, we will discuss the different types of vaccines being developed or recently released and review the highlights of the studies demonstrating their effectiveness and also focusing on the potential problem of viral mutants. What is herd immunity? Resistance to the spread of an infectious disease within a population that is based on a high proportion of individuals having pre-existing immunity as a result of previous infection or vaccination. There are two strategies for achieving herd immunity. First, the one initially tried by Sweden, proposed by the Trump administration, is to allow the virus to spread unchecked through the less vulnerable population and to keep the vulnerable isolated out of harm's way. The advantages of this approach: the government has to do very little. Infection control practices can be ignored by the young, and you can conduct business as usual. The problems: we will overwhelm our health systems. Let's look at what would happen in the U.S. if we were to allow 80% of our population to become infected. That would mean 260.8 million people would become infected. The rate of hospitalization in the U.S. is 6 to 10% of cases. That means that 15.6 to 26.8 million would be hospitalized. However, our bed capacity is 0.924 million beds. In other words, the number of infected would exceed our bed capacity by 17 to 29-fold. The death rate under this approach is 1.76% of those infected die, would translate to 4.6 million deaths. Let's look at Sweden, which openly followed a herd immunity strategy. Claiming that only the young and healthy would be infected under their laissez-faire policy, they quickly learned that you can't prevent spread to the vulnerable. As of December 22nd, Sweden has experienced 787 deaths per million of population, which is 4.5 to 10-fold higher than in its Scandinavian neighbors, Denmark, Finland, and Norway. To put this in perspective, the U.S. is doing even worse. We have 1,041 deaths per million. Unfortunately, a poorly coordinated effort has proved to be the equivalent of embracing Sweden's natural herd immunity policy. Another concern is that natural immunity is variable and depends on the severity of disease. Mild disease results in low level of antibody response that may be short-lived, while severe disease is more likely to confer long-term immunity and high levels of antibody. Therefore, a natural infection may not achieve herd immunity because a significant percent of the population experiences asymptomatic or mild disease. The second approach is to vaccinate the entire world. The advantage of this approach: it is a controlled approach that will decrease hospitalizations, decrease deaths, and has the potential to confer long-term immunity for everyone. History reveals that this is a safe and effective approach. Two classic examples are polio, which has been nearly eliminated, and smallpox, which has been eliminated from the world. We also need to address some of the potential problems with vaccination. A major worry was the immune enhancement syndrome, which has been described with another RNA virus, dengue fever. The vaccine, in this case, resulted in a very strong immune reaction that made symptoms and signs of dengue fever worse. The multi-system inflammatory disorder seen predominantly in children following COVID-19 infection is an example of immune enhancement. They suffer with high fever, skin rashes, and multi-organ damage. In clinical trials to date, there has been no evidence for immune enhancement. Hypersensitivity reactions are another potential concern, and 2 healthcare workers from the United Kingdom suffered immediate reactions to the vaccine, and both had a history of frequent allergic reactions. Symptoms can include tightness of the throat, shortness of breath, lightheadedness, and low blood pressure. For the time being, individuals with histories of frequent allergic reactions should probably avoid being vaccinated until there is an additional study. I was recently vaccinated, and as a precaution, our hospital is having everyone observed by medical personnel for 15 minutes after vaccination. The number of constituents in the vaccines are limited. Unlike influenza vaccine, none of the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines require egg products, making allergic reactions less likely. Unexpected toxicities are a concern with any vaccine. One example has been Guillain-Barré syndrome, a paralytic syndrome that was associated with past influenza vaccine. Vaccination also has the potential to precipitate other autoimmune diseases. To date, these toxicities have not been observed. What about mutant viruses? Will they be covered? The answer to this question will be discussed in video 2. Failure to generate long-term immunity. This issue will also be discussed in the second video. Anti-vaccine groups. These groups spread disinformation. The sharing of all vaccine trial results with the public will be important for instilling trust in these new vaccines. A concerted and uniform message must be delivered throughout society describing the effectiveness and safety of the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. Supply chain challenges. The vaccination of entire countries is extremely challenging from a logistics standpoint. The U.S. Operation Warp Speed predicted 20 million vaccinations by January 1st. However, the reality has been 4 million vaccinations. Dr. Ravi Anupindi of the University of Michigan Business School will be discussing the principles of supply chain management in the subsequent 3 videos. Inequity. Countries with more resources are purchasing all of the available vaccine supplies, leaving developed countries out in the cold. Similarly, we have already witnessed politicians receiving the vaccine before eligible residents from lower socioeconomic groups. The press needs to highlight these inequities, and the United Nations and the WHO, as well as the US, Europe, and economically advantaged countries in Asia, must quickly address these inequities, or the pandemic will continue. We are only as strong as our weakest link. A final question: how many will need to be vaccinated to achieve herd immunity? This graph relates efficacy of the vaccine and R sub naught to the ability to extinguish the spread of infection during the epidemic. This graph illustrates how these 2 key determinants interact. First, the higher the R sub naught, the higher the percent will need to be vaccinated. For an R sub naught of 2.0, with vaccine efficacy of 90%, like Pfizer and Moderna, the yellow, 60% of the population would need to be vaccinated, arrow 1. A higher R sub naught of 3.0 would require 80% vaccination, arrow 2. Practically, what this means, in the midst of a surge with a high R sub naught, vaccination is unlikely to significantly reduce spread. Second, the graph shows the higher the efficacy of the vaccine, the lower the percentage of the population needs to be vaccinated. Arrow 1 shows that for an efficacy of 90% and an R sub naught of 2, 60% need to be vaccinated, while for a vaccine with 70% efficacy, for the same R sub naught, 80% would need to be vaccinated, arrow 3. Estimates with regards to how many will need to be vaccinated in the U.S. varies from 60 to 90%. Taking the most optimistic estimate of 60%, this translates to a need to vaccinate 195.6 million. As of January 1st, only 4 million, or 0.5% of this goal has been achieved. We have a long way to go. In addition to the R sub naught and vaccine efficacy, modeling reveals that a factor that will have the greatest impact on ending the pandemic will be the speed at which we are able to vaccinate the population. Therefore, supply chain management would be critical for saving lives. It would be important to continue to motivate our population to adhere to infection control practices to maintain a lower R sub naught. Finally, the overall prevalence of disease is a factor. The greater the number who have already been infected, the lower the number that will need to be vaccinated. To summarize, the only safe way to induce herd immunity is by vaccination. Serious side effects, such as an immune enhancement, have not been observed. Anti-vaxxers are a concern, and disinformation must be addressed. Inequity in the distribution of vaccines needs to be overcome. The ability to achieve herd immunity will depend on the R sub naught. The higher the R sub naught, the less effective the vaccination will be for stopping infection spread. The higher the efficacy of the vaccine, the more effective, and the lower the number of individuals which will need to be vaccinated to achieve herd immunity. The rate of vaccination will also be critical and will have the greatest impact on stopping the pandemic, emphasizing the importance of supply chains. Thank you.